So let's talk about building the stories. I'm going to start here with Google, and I'm going to build a story of Charles Bielefeld, one of my wife's ancestors. And one of the things I found on Google Scholar was this article from the Smithsonian Institute about a 19th century English paper mache chair. Now you're probably thinking, paper mache, that's what you make piñatas out of, or, those decorations. How do you make a chair out of paper mache? This article talks about the construction of this paper mache and how they're working on restoring it and so on. One of the footnotes talks about the Illustrated London News from August 6, 1853, and it talks about an entire village of several buildings, 10 houses made out of paper mache that were constructed by Charles Bielefeld. He was constructed in London, England, and it was shipped to Australia to build a town. Well, that's really interesting. So what do I know about this? Well, I know in 1853, there's this note about a paper mache village that he constructed in Australia. Well, why is that important? In the 1850s, it was the Australian gold rush, and they had an influx of immigrants. So how do you build a quick village? You ship all the walls made out of paper mache to Australia, and they put all the walls together. This is one of your first manufactured homes, basically. And so I'm able to now tie this paper mache village constructed in 1853 to the 1850s gold rush and make some inferences based on the influx of immigrants moving to that area. Further researching Charles Bielefeld in Google Scholar, I get some information about a temporary House of Lords. Why is there a temporary House of Lords, and what is he doing? Well, he's constructing all of the elaborate woodwork that you would see in the House of Lords, but he's doing it all out of paper mache because the House of Lords burned in 1834, and this article is from 1835. So now we can say, well, when the House of Lords burned in 1834, the temporary House of Lords was being constructed, and Charles Bielefeld was constructing part of the materials for that project. And then we find a lot more different articles about Charles Bielefeld and the different materials that he used and the different buildings that his paper mache was used in. And so I could take all of these and I could build a contextual history of the development of London and Charles Bielefeld's influence on that. And then here's a picture of the Pantheon Bazaar in 1845. And a lot of the elaborate woodwork that you see in here is faux woodwork, and it's paper mache. So, I can take that information and utilize these images and help build the contextual history and the social history of Charles Bielefeld. And then here we have his paper mache facility. This is his factory. It's at number 15 Wellington Street North in London. And I can go see, what's still there. And then I do have a couple pages out of his catalog, and you can see how elaborate his paper mache decorations were for the buildings that he was constructing. And then this is a picture of one of the buildings, the paper mache buildings that he put together in Australia. So I was able to find the floor plans and the images in Google Images to add to the story. So what story can we write about Charles Bielefeld? Well, we know he was a paper mache artist. And why was paper mache an important architectural development? It was cheap, it was easy to create, and it was fast to install. So you could create this thing very quickly and cheaply, as opposed to having a woodworker carve all of this material. We know that he worked on historically important buildings in London. And so we can add relevant details about St. James Palace, the House of Parliament, the Pantheon, and other buildings that he worked on, and add that context to it. And we know that he built a portable village in Australia. And why was this important? Well, the time frame that was built was this large influx of immigrants and the gold rush. So let's build another story. Let's look at some newspaper articles, and we're going to build the story of my great grandfather, Ray Westerheide. And we're going to focus in that 1920s to 30s time frame when prohibition was the law of the land. And as we go through and find these newspaper articles, we find that prohibition had an impact on many people, including my great grandfather, since he was a booze runner and he had several stills that he ran, very large scale alcohol production during prohibition. And so I've got these stories about, him being the ringleader of an illicit alcohol ring, having to pay a fine of $750, being arrested with 500 gallons of illicit liquor. I'm getting the context of what was happening during prohibition and specifically what was happening to him. And so now we can take some of that information and start to build the story. We can talk about prohibition and we can talk about what he was doing there. And I know that my great grandfather had affiliations and supplied liquor to many of the well-known gangsters in the area. He delivered his alcohol from Chicago to Cincinnati, and that was his area to supply. And so, we all know the Chicago gangsters in that time period. And so my great grandfather did have some associations with some of them. I know that he managed a Kroger grocery store. I can look in the advertisements and it says, the Kroger grocery stores manager, Ray Westerheide. I did find in one of the newspaper articles talking about how he used the sugar supplied to his grocery store to supply his stills for his alcohol production. And we can look through those newspapers and we can tell what life was like in the 1930s during the Great Depression, during Prohibition, in a small farming community, because we're looking at a local newspaper telling those stories. And so let's look at John Stevie, another one of my ancestors, and we're going to just pull off from his obituary. And when you look at his obituary, you can see that he was born in 1892. He was married in 1921, and he died at the age of 71. And looking through here, we see, all of his family members and so on. We can see that he was a World War I veteran. He fought in the Battle of Argonne-Verdun in France, and he took part in the March on the Rhine in the invasion of Germany. It also says that he served 2 terms on the New Bremen Board of Public Affairs. He was a charter member and past commander of the New Bremen American Legion. He was a member of the Holy Redeemer Church and the Holy Name Society. He was an owner of the Stevie Tin Shop in New Bremen for 41 years. So we're getting a lot of things, that build around him. But now we can start looking at some of these historical events. We can look at World War I. We can look at the Battle of Argonne-Verdun. We can look at the March on the Rhine. We can look at the industries in that town and see how his tin shop might have been an important industry within the town. So when we're looking at World War I draft registration, he lists his occupation as sheet and metal worker. And in here, it has, do you claim exemptions from the draft? And he claimed an exemption. His exemption was his occupation as a sheet and metal worker, and he was the manager of that company. So why is that important? Why is his occupation as a sheet and metal worker important enough for him to say, I think I should be exempt from the draft? What's one of the necessary things during war? It's metal products. And so now I can do a little bit of research and see how sheet metal was important in World War I and how that relates to him requesting an exemption from the draft. But that exemption didn't pan out for him. He was enlisted in the military. And so I now have his Veterans Administration Master Index. So this shows that he was in the military. and it provides his rank and his unit. So he was a corporal with Battery B, the 324th Field Artillery. So right now I'm thinking, oh, he's field artillery. This is the big guns, on the battlefield. So he must have seen some, important battles. He provides his service date as 2 October 1917 to 4 June 1919. So it's less than 2 years. And now I can look at that time period. I can ask myself, what phase of the war was this? And where did that unit serve? So we know that he was discharged in 1919. We know he was enlisted in 1917. So we know that there was some training that went on for at least several months in 1917. And we can look at June of 1919 and see where that relates to the end of the war. What we find is that in this World War I transport record, he's leaving France. He left Brest, France, and arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, and in May of 1919. So he was on the ship Seattle, and we can see a list of all of the people that were on that ship with him and where they came from and so on, and where he was going. He was going to Camp Mills. So now we know that his unit had left France in May. He got back to the United States, and a couple of weeks later, he was discharged from the military. I also was able to discover the history of the 324th Field Artillery. It's a book. It's on the Internet Archives website. Great place to find old books. What I can see here is what happened. It tells me, they were in training at this location in Sherman, Ohio. Then they moved to Camp Mills in New York. And then they got on the steamship Lancashire in 1918. And they sailed over to England and got there June 12th, 1918. And then it arrived there. They disembarked to Liverpool. And then they went onto a train to Borden, England. And they spent a couple days there in camp, and so on and so forth. So I have very detailed description of where that unit was throughout that early part of their, before they even got onto the battlefield. I can get a little further in. It says the regiment proceeded by train to Sully, France, and marched overland to Bois-de-Hesse. I don't know, how far is it from Sully, France to Bois-de-Hesse? I can put that into Google Maps and I can see how far that was that they marched. It says that they were there to reinforce the artillery brigade supporting the 91st Division on September 26th. And then on the 27th, they moved into position and so on. And the interesting thing about this is, as I'm looking through this, we have to remember this is World War I, so there were very few mechanized units. This unit actually had over 500 horses to help pull their supplies and their cannons. And so I can see that information as I read through this history of this unit, and I can see how many horses died and, when they were replaced and so on. And now that's giving me a context of the battlefield conditions that I can then utilize to tell the military history for John Stevie. I'm not writing his entire life history. I'm just talking about this short 18-month period when he was in World War I. So we can use the unit history to provide that context about the battles that he may have fought in. The historical records provide the details on those battles. And then we can read other histories to see what life was like on those battlefields. And we can make inferences to talk about what his experience might have been.